Hello everyone and welcome to No Main Impact. Today I want to show you the results of a small experiment I ran by trying to make Raiden into a physical DPS. While this build doesn't revolve around her elemental burst as most efficient builds tend to do, I found it to be rather enjoyable to use and also somewhat free-to-play friendly. The results of these tests are based solely on the artifacts I have, the characters I have, and their current level of investment, so I'm sure that our players will have different outcomes. Again, this was just an experiment to see what happens, and I hope that this little test is useful to you somehow. So for this build, I'm using the Crescent Pike, 2-piece Baleflame and Bloodstained Chivalry, no constellations, and talents level 666. And that's how the stats look like. So let's do a quick A/B comparison between elemental skill with normal attacks and elemental skill with elemental burst to see how the damage changes between them. Our enemy of choice will be the Pyroflower, while trying the build I just showed you. This is the first test using only the elemental skill and normal attacks. Now, this is the second test, using the elemental skill, the elemental burst, and normal attacks. Now on this one, I will trigger a superconduct to lower the flower's physical resistance and deal more physical damage. So let's see how it fares against the first and second tests. These are the results of the previous 3 tests. As we can see, the normal attack and the burst deal about the same amount of damage, although the burst does deal a little bit more damage, while the superconduct definitely deals the most amount of damage. I repeated this test several times, and this was kind of like the norm. There were some times when the burst was a little bit higher and it was closer to the superconduct, but that is mainly related to the first attack of the burst. If I managed to trigger the critical hit, then yeah, the damage would be closer to that of the superconduct. Let's have a quick look at the supports that we are going to be having for this build. I've been using these characters throughout the test, and although they are not the highest level, they should be enough to showcase whether this build has any potential or not. So for that reason, let's repeat the same 3 tests, but now getting a few buffs from this team. Same first test, but now with Bennett. I think that right off the bat we can tell that this damage is much higher. This is the second test, using the Bennett attack buff with Raiden elemental skill and elemental burst, using only the normal attacks. Now the damage should be much greater than any of the other tests. There's something special going on here. I'll tell you in a bit. Okay, last test. Let's trigger a superconduct. What this shows us is that, yeah, Bennett does increase our damage by a good amount. The difference is very clear when compared to the previous test without any buffs. So yeah, Bennett is a great addition to increase the damage of physical Raiden. So I know you may be wondering, why did the burst get so much more damage than Super Conduct? Well, the reason is I decided to show you the biggest damage I could get with the burst. And if you manage to trigger the crit with the first hit of the burst, yeah, you can definitely out DPS the Super Conduct, but it's not really reliable on my build. So for me, at least, the best thing to do is to combine them both, to use the Super Conduct alongside the burst. Alright, so let's beat some Samurai or Ronin or whatever they are by mixing the techniques we saw on the previous tests. And while these enemies aren't super hard to beat, they do pose somewhat of a good test for this build. Lava churls are also some of the harder enemies we usually find on the overworld. And look how we quickly shaved about 1/3 of its HP. And now it's below half HP. And we have only used the burst once, and we are ready to use the burst once more. So we will trigger Bennett's buff and trigger Raiden's burst once more, and that should be enough. Yep. And we didn't even need to break his armor. Ruin Guards are an excellent test for this build, since they have a lot of physical resistance, meaning we can't damage it easily with physical damage. And even though we did trigger a Super Conduct and Bennett's buff, we are having quite a bit of trouble beating it. This is precisely one of the limitations of this kind of build. As such, I will try this again, but with another Ruin Guard and using Raiden's Elemental Burst for extra damage. As you can see, we have triggered a Super Conduct, Bennett's buff and Raiden's Elemental Burst, and we are doing much better this time around. The Ruin Guard already has less than half of its HP. And with a mix of physical and elemental attacks, it goes down. Here we have a fight against 3 Fatui. We will deal with the healer first, which is the Hydro. And the burst is giving us a ton of damage this time around. That's 2 of them. And there goes the Pyro. And now for the final monster, let's beat a Electro-infused Geobishop. There goes the infusion. But I think, yeah, we're gonna be faster than that. Now I want to include a bonus showcase. And we will see what happens when we use food alongside with Bennett's buff. And we will repeat the exact same 3 tests that we did at the beginning of the video. Okay, let's test it with the burst. Make a quick note right there, because that's where usually the rotation finishes. And it goes down. Finally, let's trigger a supercharge, so we can lower the physical resistance and see how it goes. The conclusion of these tests seems to be pretty clear. If we use Banette with food, we get the most damage. That was kind of expected. In the case of the artifacts I have, well, if you manage to trigger the crit hit with the first hit of the elemental burst, then you do get a lot of damage, but it's not really reliable, so it's best to combine it with normal hits and superconduct to get the most damage out of this build. Keeping this section a little bit shorter, the quick answer is yeah, you can beat the Spiral Abyss with this build. My results weren't as great. I did clear floor number 9 and 10 without any problems. I struggled a bit with floor 11, and floor 12 was basically impossible. I think it is down to the fact that my supports aren't exactly the most built or well-invested characters in the world, but still, I think that if another player with better supports were to try this out, would have a much better result than I did. Please remember that different players will have different results because everyone has different artifacts and different amounts of investment on their supports. Of course, if you happen to have a very similar build to mine, but with more critical rate, you would be able to trigger the critical hit of the elemental burst much more often and thus deal more damage than I do. Can physical Raiden substitute something like Eula, for example? Not really. Eula will definitely deal much more physical damage. Can this build out DPS the one with the Emblem of Severed Fate? I doubt it. But still, I found this experiment to be very fun and interesting, and for me it gives me a chance to use Raiden without relying so much on the elemental burst, and it allows me to keep her on the field pretty much all the time and only switching for triggering skills and elemental bursts from the rest of the party. If you happen to try this build out, or you have a few pieces lying around and want to experiment a bit, please leave a comment down below with your findings and let me know if they match with mine. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.